December 1941, The Pride Before the Ice. They told us the Russian winter was a myth, a story the Soviets told to frighten men who didn't know real cold. I believed it. I mocked it. I was 22, proud, and seated behind the steel heart of a Panzer III, the finest machine I had ever touched. When I looked at its dark gray armor gleaming under the pale sun, I saw proof of German superiority, of order forged into iron. We were the engine of the Reich, unstoppable and precise, rolling eastward toward Moscow. And I laughed when the veterans spoke of the ice, the snow, and the ghosts of Napoleon's army. We moved across the endless plains singing songs of victory, the tracks cutting through frozen earth like the claws of some mechanical beast. The officers spoke of destiny, of how soon we would see the Kremlin's towers glittering under our flag. Even the air smelled of confidence, oil, exhaust, and frost mixing into something that felt like glory. We believed nothing could stop us. The idea that weather could be an enemy seemed absurd. We were Germans. We built bridges across rivers, machines that breathed fire, and an empire that stretched further each month. The wind was only another challenge for discipline to conquer. But pride has a sound when it begins to crack, faint at first, like the ticking of ice before it splits. I remember the first hints, the oil thickening during dawn inspections, the men's breath turning white before their words could leave their mouths. We laughed it off. "It's only December," someone said. "The Russians will freeze before we do." The joke spread like warmth among us, hiding the first tremors of fear. Our advance slowed as the snow deepened. The panzers sank half a meter with every turn. The engines roared, straining against a world that suddenly felt heavier. The road to Moscow stretched before us like a promise written on glass, visible, fragile, and doomed to shatter. I looked at the thermometer one morning. -15. The steel under my gloves bit like teeth. Still, the command kept shouting orders of progress. The city was only a few days away. At night, we camped near the Treline, the horizon glowing red with artillery flashes. The sky was low, the stars sharp as bayonets. Inside the tank, the metal walls radiated a cold that crawled into the bones. I could feel the engines pull slow when we shut it down, like a dying animal trying to breathe. I told myself it was only fatigue, that machines, like men, needed rest. I didn't yet understand that rest in Russia meant death for anything that used oil, fire, or blood. We received new orders: hold position until reinforcements arrive. So we waited, surrounded by an ocean of frost. I looked around at the men, their faces still defiant, their boots still polished, and I saw reflections of myself, young, certain, blind. We thought our iron would save us. That belief was our last warmth. One evening, I stepped outside the tank and watched the snow fall in silence. It didn't look like an enemy. It looked pure, endless, almost peaceful. And yet, something inside me stirred uneasily. The veterans were quiet now. Their eyes followed the horizon with the same dread that soldiers reserve for artillery fire. They had seen this before, not this snow, but what followed it. I kicked at the ground, expecting solid earth, but my boots struck frozen mud. Beneath the surface, the soil was hard as stone, and something metallic glimmered faintly, an old, rusted horseshoe, maybe left from Napoleon's retreat. I stared at it for a long time before covering it again with snow. The laughter from earlier weeks had vanished. Even the officers spoke softly, as if afraid the wind might overhear. Somewhere in the distance, engines still growled, trying to move, to breathe, to defy the coming frost. But I already sensed it, the quiet before the storm that would not bring thunder, but silence. We thought the Russians were our true enemy. We were wrong. The real enemy was waiting in the air, invisible, merciless, ancient, and soon it would take everything from us. December 1941, the first shards of ice. The first bite of true winter came quietly, like a whisper we tried to ignore. The air hardened, turning each breath into shards of glass. The snow deepened, hiding the world beneath a white silence that swallowed sound and hope alike. I remember waking before dawn, scraping frost from the panzer's hatch with my bayonet, my fingers already numb through the gloves. The steel was colder than death, and it no longer obeyed us. At first, it was small things. The oil in the gearbox grew thick, refusing to flow. The machine gun jammed after only a few bursts. We struck the frozen barrels with our fists, cursing through chattering teeth. The cold had become a living thing, creeping into the joints of man and metal. Still, our officers insisted it was temporary. Once we reach Moscow, they said, this will all be over. The city was just 30 kilometers away, but each kilometer now felt like a lifetime. The veterans didn't speak much anymore. They'd seen this kind of silence before, the one that doesn't come from peace but from the slow suffocation of movement. Every sound we made was muffled by snow, boots crunching, shovels scraping, engines gasping. I could no longer feel my feet. Some wrapped rags around their boots, others stole pieces of canvas from burned-out trucks. Discipline dissolved slowly, quietly, like ice melting inside a closed hand. By midday, our fuel had turned into a sluggish black syrup. We built fires under the tanks to warm the engines, watching the flames lick the steel. The heat was desperate, primitive, almost humiliating. German precision had no meaning here. Nature had stripped us bare, down to our animal instincts. A soldier from another crew approached, his eyelashes white with frost. They said the oil freezes at -30, he muttered, voice trembling. It's -38. No one answered him. Nights became endless. The darkness stretched for 15, 16 hours, broken only by the flicker of dying fires. The cold pressed against our shelters like an invisible siege. Some men began to cough blood, others simply stopped speaking. Food came frozen, unchewable. We hammered at tins of meat with bayonets, heating them against the exhaust pipes when the engine still ran. It was survival reduced to its simplest form, one breath, one spark, one heartbeat at a time. And yet, through the suffering, there was still arrogance. It's only weather, one officer barked when a man collapsed beside his tank. Get up. The Führer expects victory. Victory, that word now felt hollow, like a coin dropped in snow. We obeyed, because obedience was all we had left. But inside, something was changing. We were beginning to understand that no human command could conquer what surrounded us. One morning, I woke to the sound of breaking metal. The drive sprocket of a neighboring panzer had snapped clean in half. It lay there, steaming faintly, as if the machine itself had cried out in pain. The men stood around it in silence. No one cursed, no one spoke. There was nothing to say. We buried the broken part in snow, not out of respect, but because leaving it visible felt like an omen. The horizon was still full of promises. Maps said Moscow was close, but the land had already turned against us. Even the birds were gone. Only the wind remained, howling across the steppe like a ghost warning us to turn back. That night, I lay inside the frozen shell of the panzer, listening to the metal contract and groan. I could almost hear it breathe, slow, heavy, dying. I thought of the veterans' warnings and realized how foolish our laughter had been. The winter was not a myth. It was real, patient, and merciless. And it had only just begun to show its teeth. December 1941, the Weeping Gears. The morning the Panzer III died, the sun never rose. A gray haze hung over the steppe, thick and motionless, as if the sky itself had frozen. I remember turning the ignition, hearing the engine cough once, twice, and then a dull metallic crack, like a bone snapping under ice. The tank shuddered, exhaled one last cloud of steam, and went silent. It wasn't just a machine stopping. It was as if something inside me stopped with it. We tried everything. We burned rags soaked in fuel under the chassis, we poured boiling water over the joints, we cursed, kicked, and prayed. But the oil had turned to wax, the fuel lines to veins of ice. When we opened the engine hatch, the gears looked like they were crying, tiny droplets of frozen lubricant hanging from the steel like tears. It was a sight I'll never forget. The commander ordered us to keep trying. "This tank is worth more than any of you," he shouted, his breath fogging the air like smoke from a dying fire. None of us argued. The Panzer was our shelter, our home, our heartbeat. Without it, we were just meat standing in the open. But no amount of will could wake a corpse. By noon, we accepted the truth. The machine that had carried us across half of Europe had surrendered before we did. Around us, the field was a graveyard of motionless armor. Black silhouettes scattered across the snow, panzers, half-tracks, supply trucks, all frozen mid-step, like statues from a war that had suddenly stopped. The silence was unbearable. Only the wind moved, whispering through the tank barrels and making them hum like organ pipes in some cathedral of death. We tore pieces from tarps to cover the engine, but the cold didn't care. It crept in through every seam, every breath. One of the gunners tried to light a cigarette. It snapped in half before it could burn. Another soldier pressed his hands to the exhaust pipe for warmth. The metal tore the skin from his palms. He didn't even scream, just stared at his blood crystallizing in seconds. I remember watching the smoke from a nearby fire drift toward us. Thick, black, useless. The smell of diesel mixed with snow and despair. Somewhere, an officer's voice crackled through a frozen radio, repeating the same message again and again. Advance. Keep moving forward. But forward was no longer a direction. It was a memory. By evening, frost had crept over every surface inside the tank. The controls glittered like they'd been dusted with powdered glass. I brushed at it with my gloves, trying to keep the place clean, as if tidiness could save us. My crewmate, Ernst, leaned against the turret wall, whispering something I couldn't hear. When I asked, he looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "It's not the Russians that will kill us." He was right. The enemy we had been taught to hate hadn't even arrived yet, and already our ranks were thinning. Men froze standing guard. Others wandered into the snow, chasing mirages of warmth that didn't exist. Every morning, there were fewer of us. That night, the temperature dropped past -40. The air burned to breathe. I tried to sleep, but the metal around me creaked and groaned, like it was mourning its own death. I laid my hand on the driver's lever, half expecting it to twitch, to come alive again. It didn't. When the first Soviet artillery shells began to fall in the distance, we didn't even flinch. The sound was faint, almost comforting, proof that something still moved in that frozen world. But our machines could no longer answer. In that moment, I understood something terrible. The Panzer wasn't just frozen, we were. We had become statues of arrogance, locked in place by the very land we thought we could conquer. And the Russians were coming. December 1941, the land that swallows soldiers. The world had turned into one color, white. White sky, white ground, white death. Somewhere beneath that silence, men still fought, but even the war seemed to have slowed to the pace of the freezing wind. The earth itself was our enemy now. It refused to yield, to move, to give us footing. I no longer felt like a soldier of the Reich. I felt like a ghost wandering through a land that did not want me there. We tried to dig defensive positions, but the shovels bounced off the ground as if striking steel. The soil was frozen solid, hard as iron. When the sun appeared, it only mocked us, thawing the top layer into a mud so thick it swallowed boots, rifles, and even the dead. Then night returned, sealing everything beneath a crust of ice. Every day, the land changed its trap, and every night it claimed new victims. I saw men lose fingers, toes, and reason. They wrapped their hands in torn uniforms, but the fabric froze into stiff shells. One of our loaders, Wilhelm, screamed when his boot got stuck in the mud. He tried to pull free, and his foot came out leaving the boot behind. The others laughed nervously at first. Laughter was the only thing that still reminded us we were human, but no one laughed when he collapsed hours later, his leg black and rigid. Our weapons betrayed us too. Bolts froze shut, barrels cracked from the cold. A comrade's rifle exploded in his hands after he tried to fire a shell that had iced inside the chamber. He didn't even have time to curse. Blood steamed for a moment, then froze into dark crystals on the snow. The medics couldn't do anything. Even morphine was frozen solid. We learned to stop trusting our machines. We learned to stop trusting the ground. We learned that our enemy wasn't the Soviet soldier with his rifle. It was this country itself, vast and merciless, swallowing everything foreign. The veterans whispered that Russia didn't fight wars. It simply outlived its invaders. I began to believe them. Our commander ordered us to move the disabled tanks into a defensive line, to use them as bunkers. We tried, but half of them were welded to the ground by ice. So we fought inside the carcasses of our own machines, steel tombs half buried in frozen earth. The air stank of diesel, sweat, and fear. When we fired the gun, the recoil echoed across the plain like thunder trapped beneath snow. The Soviets were out there somewhere, invisible in the storm. We caught glimpses, a shadow moving between trees, a flash of a muzzle, a scream cut short by the wind. They were patient, watching us decay, letting the cold finish what their bullets began. One afternoon, I went to fetch water from a nearby ditch. The surface was frozen, but beneath it I could see something dark. I knelt, broke the ice with my knife, and realized it wasn't water, it was a man. A German, frozen beneath the surface, eyes open, his expression calm. Snow had erased his nameplate. I stared at him for a long time, wondering how many more the land had hidden beneath its white armor. When I returned to camp, the firewood was gone. Men huddled around the dead engine of a tank, trying to draw warmth from the memory of its heat. I sat beside them, silent. No one spoke of victory anymore. No one spoke of Moscow. The only thing we wanted was to survive the night. And then the ground shook. Artillery, distant, dull, but growing. We looked toward the horizon and saw faint flashes, red bleeding through white. It wasn't the fire of hope, it was the fire of something coming for us. That was the night I stopped believing we were conquerors. We weren't marching through Russia. Russia was consuming us, one breath, one man, one machine at a time. December 1941, the face of a Russian soldier. The snow had grown so thick that it blurred the line between ground and sky. Everything was white, except for the blood that occasionally stained it like ink spilled on paper. We hadn't seen the enemy for days. Only their presence lingered in the distance, the echo of shells, the faint crack of a rifle, the shadow of something moving just beyond sight. The cold had erased the front line. We were no longer advancing, no longer retreating. We were simply there, waiting to be buried by the storm or by the Soviets, whichever came first. I had been standing guard near our immobilized panzer when I saw movement among the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then I saw the shape, human, slow, deliberate, merging with the snow as if born from it. He came closer, crouched low, a rifle clutched tight against his chest. My heart pounded, not from fear but from disbelief. The Russians were supposed to be half dead from the cold. Yet there he was, alive, steady, silent. I aimed, hands trembling, trying to align the sights through the frost. He saw me at the same instant. Our eyes met across a stretch of white so still it felt sacred. Then he fired. The shot was muffled, a dry snap swallowed by the air. The bullet hit the tank side inches from my face, spraying shards of steel and snow. I fell, rolled, returned fire. My shot struck him in the chest. He collapsed without a sound, the snow rising around him like a sigh. I waited before approaching, gun raised. When I finally reached him, he was lying face up, snow already dusting his uniform. He couldn't have been older than 19. His rifle was clutched in one hand, his other still reaching forward as if grasping for something beyond life. His eyes were open, fixed on the gray sky, calm, unblinking, almost peaceful. I knelt beside him, breathing hard. The air burned my throat. His coat was thicker than ours, fur-lined and heavy. Frost covered his lips. There was no hatred in his face, only exhaustion. A small icon hung from his neck, a tiny metal image of a saint, its surface polished smooth by wear. I remember touching it, feeling the cold sting my fingers. I wondered if his mother had given it to him, the way mine had given me a photograph before I left Hamburg. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I saw in him a reflection, not of an enemy, but of myself. The same hollow cheeks, the same cracked lips, the same terror hidden beneath the uniform. We were both victims of orders shouted by men far away from the snow. Ernst arrived a moment later, rifle ready. "You got him?" he asked. I nodded. He glanced at the body and muttered, "They say the Russians don't feel the cold." He tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. We stripped the dead soldier's coat, not out of cruelty, but necessity. The wind howled louder now. Mercy had no place here. When night came, I couldn't sleep. The image of that young face haunted me, pale, calm, too human. I realized then that the winter didn't choose sides. It consumed everyone equally. For every German who froze, a Russian froze too. For every tank that died, a Soviet rifle jammed. We weren't fighting a war between nations anymore. We were both fighting against the same invisible god, the cold. In the early hours, I woke to distant singing. Soft voices carried through the storm, Russian, melodic, mournful. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone said enough. It was a song for the dead. I pressed my back against the frozen armor of the panzer and listened until the wind drowned it out. The next day, I buried the Russian boy beneath a drift of snow. No flag, no prayer, only silence. When I covered his face for the last time, the snow clung to my gloves like ash. The winter had taken him first. But I knew it would come for me soon enough. December 1941, the Speech of Iron. We gathered that morning because the commander said it was an order from headquarters, a moral necessity, he called it. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was still thick with frost, the kind that makes sound travel strangely far. Someone had built a fire out of shattered crates, its smoke rising thin and gray into the pale sky. Around it, the remains of a battalion stood, men hollow-eyed, unshaven, motionless, their uniforms stiff as bark. The war had stripped us of everything except obedience, and now even that felt brittle. The commander stepped onto the wreck of a supply sled, a piece of paper trembling in his gloved hand. He cleared his throat, though no one was speaking. His voice cracked at first, but then steadied, carrying words written in Berlin, words that smelled of polished desks and heated offices, far from this frozen graveyard. The Führer sends his pride and faith to the soldiers of the Eastern Front. Your courage is unmatched. Your endurance will bring Germany victory. Somewhere behind me, a man coughed, deep, wet, final. No one turned to look. The commander continued reading, his lips pale and shaking. Every hardship is a test of the German spirit. The eyes of the fatherland are upon you. The fire hissed as the wind caught it, scattering sparks across his boots. I watched his fingers tremble and realized he wasn't shaking from cold. He didn't believe the words either. The speech went on, promises of reinforcements, of spring, of triumph. Lies frozen in ink. Around me, men stared blankly ahead. One leaned against a burned-out truck, another stared at his hands as if they were no longer his. We had seen too much to be moved by slogans. The Reich could send its speeches, but it couldn't send fuel, food, or warmth. When the commander finished, he folded the paper carefully, almost reverently, as though it were sacred. Then he looked up, and for a moment, his mask cracked. "Hold your ground," he whispered, voice almost breaking. "That's all that's left to do." He turned away before anyone could answer. After he left, no one spoke for a long time. The fire sputtered, and the snow began to fall again, slow, deliberate, like ash from an invisible sky. Ernst muttered, "He reads like a priest at a funeral." I didn't reply. We both knew the sermon was for us. That evening, I found the paper discarded near the tank. The wind had blown it halfway across the clearing. I picked it up, the ink already smudged, the edges stiff with frost. I read the lines again, "Your endurance will bring Germany victory." The words felt like ghosts, empty and weightless. I tore it in half and fed it to the fire. The paper curled, darkened, and vanished. The flames flared for an instant, warming my hands. I thought of the factories that had built our tanks, the speeches that had sent us here, the faith we were told to carry like a weapon. All of it, fuel, iron, belief, burned the same way in the end. As night fell, the temperature dropped again. Men wrapped themselves in blankets that had long lost their warmth. I lay inside the dead panzer, watching frost crawl across the glass, tracing veins of white over the metal. The wind outside howled like a sermon no one wanted to hear. That day, I learned that words could freeze too, stiff, fragile, beautiful for a moment before they shattered. And no speech, no banner, no god of war could thaw the hearts of men who had already turned to ice. December 1941. The frozen soup. We had stopped counting the days. Time no longer flowed forward, it simply froze like everything else. Hunger became the only thing that reminded us we were alive. It gnawed at us more faithfully than any enemy ever could. Our supplies had vanished weeks ago, swallowed by the distance between us and the supply lines. The few tins of meat we had left were frozen solid, and we cracked them open with bayonets like breaking stones. That morning, we tried to make soup. A ridiculous word for what it was. Melted snow with a few gray slices of potato floating in it. We huddled around a dented mess pot balanced over a tiny fire made from pieces of a broken crate. The flames flickered weakly, licking at the iron, barely enough to warm our fingers. When the water began to steam, it smelled faintly of smoke and mud. It could have been poison, and we would still have eaten it. Ernst stirred the pot with a stick. "They say the Russians get supplies by sled," he said. "Food, vodka, everything." He grinned bitterly. "Maybe the snow likes them better." Nobody answered. We didn't have the strength to curse, much less to hate. Our throats were too dry for words. The first spoonful burned my tongue. It was barely warm, but it felt like life itself. I closed my eyes and, for a second, imagined my mother's kitchen in Hamburg, the smell of bread, the crackle of firewood, the laughter that now felt like it belonged to another species. I tried to remember the taste of home, but all I could feel was the crunch of ice between my teeth. By nightfall, our fire died. The wind howled again, sweeping snow into our shelter. One of the men, Karl, tried to light another fire with frozen matches. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped them into the snow. He laughed, a strange high sound that didn't belong to a sane man. "We're the best army in the world," he said through cracked lips. "And we can't even cook potatoes." No one corrected him. I looked at my reflection on the side of the tank, a face I barely recognized. Frost in my beard, skin gray from cold, eyes hollow. Somewhere beyond the trees, the Soviets were moving again. We could hear the distant rumble of their artillery, steady and alive, like a heartbeat in the dark. That night, I dreamt of bread, real bread, soft and warm. When I woke, my teeth were clenched so tight they ached. The soup pot was frozen over again, a thin crust of ice sealing what little was left. I tapped it gently, and the sound echoed like glass breaking. The hunger didn't hurt anymore. It had become something quieter, heavier, like a stone lodged in my chest. The snow outside fell without end, covering our footprints, our camp, even the ashes of the fire. As if the world itself wanted to erase us. And it almost succeeded. December 1941. Silence in the trenches. The guns had gone quiet. For the first time in weeks, there was no thunder, no shouting, no sound of engines dying in the cold. Only the wind. It moved through the camp like a thief, stealing warmth, stealing life. Our trenches were shallow, dug more from desperation than strategy. The walls were lined with ice that glittered faintly under the gray sky. We sat there, motionless, listening to the wood of our rifles crack as it froze. Men slept sitting upright, rifles clutched in their hands like crucifixes. Some never woke. One morning, I noticed Meller still sitting in the corner of the trench, head bowed, a faint smile frozen on his face. I called his name. He didn't answer. His eyes were open, glassy, staring at nothing. He looked peaceful, too peaceful. We covered him with his greatcoat and moved on. There was no ceremony, no grave. The earth was too hard to dig, and there were too many of us dying to keep count. The cold killed without sound or fury. It was a patient executioner. You didn't feel it take you. First your fingers stopped hurting. Then your feet. Then the world grew softer, quieter, almost kind. That was how it tricked you. I saw a man smile as he froze to death, still clutching his rifle as if guarding his dreams. The silence was worse than the artillery. When the guns stopped, you could hear everything else, the crackle of ice forming on fabric, the faint wheeze of breath from those who were still alive, the groan of trees bending under snow. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to end. At dusk, the sky turned red for a few minutes, not from battle, but from the sun setting behind the clouds. The light fell across the camp like blood. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how wrong it felt to see beauty here. That night, I lay half buried in snow beside the Panzer's track, my coat stiff as armor. I could hear the faint hum of the frozen metal, the whisper of wind through its barrel. I closed my eyes and imagined spring, grass, birds, rivers that moved. But when I opened them again, there was only white. Men talk about the roar of war, the chaos, the fire, the shouting. But the truth is, war doesn't end in noise. It ends in silence. And the silence, once it comes, never leaves you. December 1941. The impossible order. The message came through the radio just before dawn, carried on a wave of static and madness. Stand fast. Resist to the last cartridge. No retreat. No surrender. The voice was from Berlin, calm and certain, as if it were broadcasting from another planet. Around me, men listened with blank faces, their breath freezing in the air. None of us spoke, but I could see the same thought in every pair of eyes. We have no cartridges left. The radio crackled again, repeating the command, a voice of authority that knew nothing of our hunger, our dead engines, our rifles locked with ice. Hitler wanted heroes. What he had now were statues of frost, soldiers without bullets, standing in the ruins of their own machines. Ernst spat into the snow. "They think we can fight the wind," he muttered. His words drifted away like smoke. Our commander tried to rally us. He shouted something about honor, about the Reich, about faith, but his voice trembled, and the men just stared. No one cheered. No one saluted. The order from Berlin had stripped away the last illusion that we mattered. We scavenged what ammunition we could from the frozen dead. A few clips here, a handful of grenades there. I remember the sound of the pins rattling in my hand. Such a small noise, and yet it felt like life itself. We loaded the guns, knowing it was pointless. The Soviets were growing stronger each day, fed by an endless stream of supplies and men. We were ghosts with rifles. That night, the snow returned. Thick, heavy, relentless. The world turned white again, erasing trenches, roads, everything. It was as if the earth wanted to bury the war itself. I watched the wind sculpt shapes out of snow, helmets, rifles, faces. They looked like soldiers frozen mid-march. When the attack came at dawn, it wasn't a wave of men but a storm of sound. The first shells landed among the tanks, shaking the ground. Our machine guns fired a few desperate bursts before jamming. Then the Soviets came, shadows moving fast through the snow, shouting nothing, just advancing, rifles raised. We fought because we had to, not because we believed. My rifle jammed after 5 shots. I remember hitting it against the tank's armor in rage, screaming without realizing it. Then a blast threw me backward. When I looked up, the sky was red again, this time from fire, not sunset. Somewhere in the chaos, I heard the commander shouting the same words that came from Berlin, "No retreat!" But his voice was swallowed by the wind. When it was over, there was only the sound of snow falling onto the still bodies. No retreat, no surrender, no survivors. That was the order we followed. December 1941. The flames of a book. We had taken shelter in the ruins of a wooden house, or what was left of it. The walls leaned inward, the roof half collapsed under the weight of snow. Inside, the cold was less biting but still merciless. We built a small fire in what used to be the living room, feeding it with broken furniture, paper scraps, anything that could burn. While searching for wood, I found it, a book, buried beneath shattered glass. Its cover was torn, but the title was still clear, Goethe, Faust. I hadn't seen that name in years. Once I had studied literature. Once I had believed in words. Now I stared at them as if they belonged to another species. I opened the first page, my gloves trembling. The letters looked strange in the flickering firelight, like runes from a forgotten civilization. For a moment, I hesitated. Burning a book felt like treason, not against the Reich, but against everything human. Yet the fire was dying, and the night was long. One by one, I tore the pages out and fed them to the flames. The paper curled and blackened, the words turning to sparks. I watched Goethe's verses vanish, line by line, and felt tears sting my eyes, not from the smoke, but from shame. I wasn't mourning the loss of a book. I was mourning the death of everything we once claimed to fight for: art, thought, decency, reason. Ernst watched in silence. When the fire grew stronger, he whispered, "At least the words still give us warmth." It was a cruel truth. The fire burned bright for a while, enough to make us believe in life again. Outside, the wind howled. I could hear faint voices, Russian, distant, singing. Maybe they were celebrating a victory. Maybe they were burying their dead. It didn't matter. The war had consumed the poets and the soldiers alike. When the last page turned to ash, I pressed my hands over the fire, feeling its heat bite my skin. For the first time, I understood what we had become. The fire that once built our empire was now burning what made us human. The flames danced, and I thought, this is Germany now, light made from destruction. And when the fire died, darkness reclaimed everything. January 1942. Prisoners of ice. We tried to move the tank one last time before dawn. The order was to reposition for defense, though none of us believed there was anything left to defend. The tracks were frozen solid, fused to the ground as if welded by invisible chains. We pushed, cursed, strained, but the panzer didn't move. The land had claimed it, body and soul. We were trapped. Not by enemy lines, not by command, but by nature itself. The ice had become our cage. The Soviets came at sunrise. Their silhouettes appeared through the snow like ghosts in a white fog. They moved slowly, cautiously. They knew we were finished. We fired a few shots out of instinct, out of pride, maybe out of fear. Then we heard it, the deep, rolling thunder of their artillery. The ground shook, and the world exploded into fragments of light and ice. When the shelling stopped, our commander was gone. Ernst was bleeding from his arm, pale as the snow around him. I dragged him behind the wreck of the Panzer, my hands shaking too much to feel the cold anymore. The Soviets were closing in. You could hear their boots crunching through the ice, steady, methodical, merciless. Someone shouted in Russian. Another voice answered. Then came the final command, short, sharp, absolute. The firing started again, closer this time. I could hear the bullets hitting metal, slicing through the air like the hiss of knives. We tried to surrender, waving a white rag torn from a blanket. But the snowstorm swallowed everything, sound, sight, mercy. When they finally reached us, I dropped my rifle and raised my hands. They trembled so violently that the weapon slipped from my grasp. The first Russian I saw up close wasn't a monster. He was just another soldier, his face red from cold, eyes tired, uniform covered in frost. He looked at me with something that wasn't hatred, but contempt. "You thought winter was a myth," he said in broken German. Then he turned away. We were prisoners, but in truth, we had been prisoners long before that day, chained not by ice, but by lies, by pride, by the blindness of men who believed they could conquer the world. As they led us away across the frozen plain, I looked back at the Panzer. It stood there half-buried, a dark monument in an ocean of white. The wind howled around it, and for a moment, I could almost hear the gears turning again, as if the machine still remembered what it once was. But it was only the sound of the wind, the same wind that had destroyed everything. January 1942. The invisible enemy. The cold was no longer just weather. It had become a living thing that crawled beneath our skin and waited for our hearts to stop. In the prison camp, the snow never melted. It fell endlessly, layer upon layer, until even the barbed wire looked like lace. The Soviets no longer needed guards. The frost kept us contained better than any wall could. I watched men die without a sound. They didn't scream anymore. They simply slowed down, sat in the snow, and faded. Frost formed in their eyelashes before they stopped breathing. The worst part was how quiet it all was. Death here was as gentle as sleep. Rumors passed between us like whispers. Soviet soldiers losing fingers, whole patrols freezing in forests. The cold was devouring both armies equally. There was no courage in it, no glory, only endurance. Even the victors looked half dead. Sometimes, at night, I'd hear coughing from the Russian side, the same dry, brittle sound that echoed through our own tents. I realized then that the winter didn't recognize language, rank, or flag. It was the perfect soldier, invisible, tireless, loyal to no one. We no longer feared bullets. We feared the cold breath that slipped through torn fabric, the frost that grew like mold on boots, the touch of metal that peeled skin away. I learned to sleep sitting upright so my body wouldn't freeze to the ground. The war had become something quieter, not men fighting, but men simply trying not to disappear. And one by one, we did. January 1942. Voices in the wind. The wind never stopped. It moved through the camp like a memory, whispering in a language older than war. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I listened to it and heard things, names, laughter, the echo of engines that no longer ran. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was the ghosts of those who had fallen along the road to Moscow. One night, a young soldier beside me began shouting for his mother. He thrashed in his sleep, eyes wide, teeth chattering. When we tried to wake him, we realized he was already gone. The cold had taken him mid-dream. His cry hung in the air long after his body went still, carried away by the wind like a prayer no one would answer. Others began to lose themselves too. A medic swore he saw angels perched on the fence posts. Another claimed to have heard music, a piano, faint but clear, coming from the forest. We laughed at first, but deep down we wanted to believe it. Anything was better than silence. I began to imagine voices of my own, the men we'd left behind, the sound of our tank engine trying to start, the hum of life that once defined us. The wind twisted those sounds together, playing them back to me like fragments of a forgotten world. Sometimes I spoke back. I told the wind my name, though even that was beginning to feel uncertain. I told it I didn't want to die here. It never answered, but it carried my words away. Perhaps to the dead. Perhaps to no one at all. Out there, beyond the snow, the world still existed. But for us, trapped in this white silence, it might as well have been a dream. January 1942, the enemy who never sleeps. At night, the Soviets came again, not in the loud, clumsy way of the early battles, but in silence. They moved like shadows through the snow, their white coats blending with the drifts. You could barely see them until they were already close, their breath fogging in the moonlight. I woke to gunfire, short, sharp bursts that shattered the stillness. The guards shouted in Russian, the prisoners scrambled for cover, though there was nowhere to hide. The flashes lit up faces twisted in confusion and terror. It was over in minutes. When the firing stopped, the night returned to its usual hush, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I saw them, the bodies of men from both sides scattered across the ice. Some still clutched their weapons, others lay with their eyes open, staring into the frozen sky. I recognized one of the attackers by his uniform. He couldn't have been older than 18. His rifle was still warm in his hands. I wondered what drove them, the same thing that had once driven us, perhaps, orders, pride, or the simple refusal to die quietly. But there was something different in their eyes, something I almost envied. They looked awake, alive, determined. The Soviets seemed to draw strength from the cold itself, moving through it as if it belonged to them. We, the invaders, were just guests in their eternal winter, and unwelcome ones at that. That night, I lay awake listening to the snow shift outside. Every sound, every creak of ice felt like footsteps approaching. The enemy no longer came with fanfare or fury. He came with silence, and he never slept. January 1942, the attempt to flee. Escape was never part of the plan. It was madness, a death sentence written in frost, but staying meant the same. When the guards thinned after another blizzard, a few of us decided to try. There were 5 men, including me. We didn't speak of courage. There was no such thing left. Only instinct, the last spark of life refusing to be extinguished. We left at night. The snow was waist-deep, the sky moonless. The cold was so sharp it sounded like glass breaking with every step. We carried nothing but rags, a stolen compass, and a frozen loaf of bread. Behind us, the camp lights faded until they became stars. For a while, it almost felt like freedom. The air was painfully pure, the silence immense. But soon, the wind turned against us. It erased our footprints, blinded our direction, swallowed our breath. The compass needle trembled, then froze solid. One of the men, Otto, fell. We tried to lift him, but his body had gone rigid. We left him there, covered by snow, not out of cruelty, but because mercy had lost all meaning. By morning, only 3 of us remained. The horizon was a blur of white, no trees, no roads, no world. My lips were cracked open, bleeding ice. The second man collapsed before noon, the third began to laugh, a hollow, hysterical sound, before wandering off into the storm. I kept walking until I couldn't tell if my legs were still moving. Then I turned back. There was nothing to return to, yet somehow I did. The guards said nothing when they saw me. They didn't need to. The snow had already judged me. In Russia, you don't escape. You just vanish, and the wind forgets your name. January 1942, the White Surrender. It happened quietly, as everything did in that endless winter. The Soviets surrounded what was left of us at dawn, shadows in the fog, rifles steady. We were too weak to resist. When they shouted for us to surrender, we didn't even raise our weapons. Our arms lifted themselves as if by instinct, trembling, empty. My hands shook so violently that the rifle slipped from my grasp and fell into the snow. A Russian soldier stepped forward, his breath visible in the air. He stared at me, eyes hard but not cruel. His words came slowly, in rough German, "You believed in the sun of December." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to defend, not pride, not ideology, not even the illusion of survival. They took us prisoner, herding us toward a column of smoke rising from the tree-line. We passed the wreckage of our own machines, tanks frozen mid-battle, half-buried like fossils. The Panzer III I once drove stood there, covered in ice, its gun pointing uselessly toward the sky. I reached out and brushed the snow from its armor. It didn't feel like steel anymore. It felt like a gravestone. The Soviets didn't smile. They didn't celebrate. They just looked tired, men as broken as we were, hardened by the same winter that had devoured both sides. When they led us away, I didn't look back again. The snow covered our tracks almost instantly, as if the world was eager to forget. That day, the war didn't end for me with a bullet or an explosion. It ended with silence, the quiet sound of surrender in a land that had already claimed us long before we raised our hands. January 1942, the frozen field. They brought us to a shelter that barely deserved the name, a wooden structure sagging under the weight of snow, its windows sealed with frost. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and death. Dozens of men huddled together, wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. Some still breathed, others didn't. No one bothered to check anymore. The walls were lined with Soviet posters, Stalin's face staring down from the peeling paper, his mustache drawn in bold black lines. His eyes followed us wherever we moved, just as Hitler's had in every barracks we'd once known. It struck me then how both men shared the same gaze, cold, unblinking, certain of their own eternity. I sat near the stove, watching the embers fade. Each flicker of light revealed another motionless figure leaning against the wall. The guard said nothing, even victory seemed hollow here. The war had turned everyone into prisoners, some behind fences, others behind ideas. I thought of home, of Hamburg under the rain, of the smell of coffee and diesel mixed in the harbor air. It felt impossibly distant, like a story someone else had told me. My hands were blistered and white, the nails blackened. I no longer recognized them as mine. A Russian guard handed me a cup of water, frozen solid. He smirked, maybe out of pity, maybe out of irony. I set it by the fire and watched it thaw, drop by drop. When I looked around, I saw nothing but the same thing on every face, emptiness. The kind that comes when faith, fear, and hatred all die at once. That night, I understood, we hadn't lost the war in Moscow or in the snow. We had lost it inside ourselves, long before the first frost fell. Spring 1945, when the ice finally melted. Years later, when the thaw came, I was no longer the man who had marched toward Moscow. The Reich had turned to dust, and Germany was nothing but ruins and silence. I walked through Hamburg again, my city, my home, but it felt foreign, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The snow was gone, yet I could still feel it in my bones. Every gust of cold wind carried me back to that frozen hell, to the tank that would not start, to the faces of men who vanished into the white. The war had ended, but the winter had never left us. It lived beneath the skin, in the silence that followed every loud noise, in the emptiness behind every victory speech. I heard people say later that the Russian winter had defeated us. They were wrong. It wasn't the cold that destroyed us, it was what we brought with us: arrogance, blindness, the belief that steel and will could conquer nature itself. Now, when the wind turns sharp and the frost touches my window, I close my eyes and still hear the Panzer's gears struggling to turn. And I remember what the snow taught me: the greatest enemy is the one that waits inside you.